The first message was a small, hand-carved bird, left on a survey marker deep in the forest. The last one was delivered to her door, hundreds of miles away in the city. Welcome to Echoed Chronicles. Our story tonight begins in the vast, silent expanse of Oregon's Umpqua National Forest. The job was a lifeline, and Maya Linden knew it. After 6 months of sending out resumes that vanished into the digital ether, the offer from Apex Geotechnical felt like a miracle. Junior Field Surveyor. The pay was modest, but the work was exactly what she'd spent 4 years of university studying for. The assignment was a 6-week contract in the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon, mapping and sampling a quadrant designated for potential mineral exploration. It was the kind of solitary, rugged work she craved. Her car, a 10-year-old Subaru Forester that had seen better days, rattled reassuringly as she turned off Highway 138 and onto a smaller county road. The air, which had smelled of hot asphalt and diesel fumes on the I-5 corridor, was now thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Towering Douglas firs crowded the roadside, their immense trunks forming a near-solid wall of bark and shadow. The late afternoon sun struggled to pierce the canopy, sending down slanted, dusty rays that illuminated floating pollen and insects. The town of Glide was little more than a wide spot in the road, a cluster of buildings that serviced the loggers, anglers, and the trickle of tourists heading into the forest. Maya's rental cabin was another 5 miles past the town, down a gravel road marked only by a faded wooden sign that read Tiller Trail. Her tires crunched over the loose stone, the sound loud in the profound quiet. The cabin was exactly as advertised: small, rustic, and isolated. It was set back from the road in a clearing, a simple A-frame with a dark green metal roof and a wide front porch. A stack of firewood, neatly cut and seasoned, stood against one wall. The landlord, a man named Mr. Henderson who she'd spoken to only over the phone, had left the key under a ceramic pot holding a withered geranium. Inside, it smelled of cedar and wood smoke. The furniture was sturdy and plain. A small kitchenette lined one wall, a pot-bellied stove occupied a corner of the main room, and a narrow staircase led to a sleeping loft. It was perfect. It was a space where she could exist with her work, a quiet place to retreat to after long days in the woods. She unpacked her duffel bags, stacking her technical manuals and survey maps on the small wooden dining table. Her personal effects, a handful of paperback novels, a photo of her sister, her laptop, took up only a small corner of the available space. Her phone buzzed. It was her supervisor, Greg Shaw. "Maya, you make it all right?" His voice was tinny through the spotty reception. "Yeah, just got here. The cabin's great." She walked over to the window, looking out into the dense woods that pressed in on the clearing. "Reception is a little weak, though." "Not surprised. You won't have any up in the survey quadrant," he said. "Just make sure you check in every evening when you get back to the cabin. Send a text. If I don't hear from you by 8 p.m., I start the call list. You remember the protocol. Text you by 8. If no text, you call my phone. If no answer, you call the landlord. If he can't confirm I'm back, you call the Douglas County Sheriff. That's the one. Don't make me call the sheriff. Linden. The paperwork is a nightmare." He sounded like he was smiling. "Your survey gear was delivered to the land office in Glide. Pick it up in the morning. Your grid maps are GPS coded. Stick to the plan, stick to the schedule. Any questions?" "No, I think I'm good." "All right, stay safe out there. Talk to you tomorrow." The line went dead. Maya set the phone down on the counter. The silence of the cabin settled around her again, heavier this time. It wasn't an unpleasant silence, just a profound one. It was the sound of being truly alone. That night, she slept soundly in the loft, the unfamiliar quiet a comforting blanket. The next morning, she drove into Glide and picked up her equipment. A heavy-duty Trimble GPS unit, a geological hammer, sample bags, a handheld core drill, and an emergency satellite beacon. It was all top-of-the-line gear, and laying it out on the cabin floor felt like a ritual, a preparation for a sacred duty. Her first day in the field was an exercise in acclimation. She parked the Forester at a designated pull-off on a logging road, double-checked her pack, and started her hike. The survey quadrant was a few miles in, a steep, thickly wooded area that hadn't seen active logging in decades. The air was cool and still under the canopy. Her job was straightforward: navigate to a predetermined GPS coordinate, document the surface geology, take a rock or soil sample, label it, and move on to the next point. She found the first survey marker, a small orange flag on a thin metal stake, exactly where the GPS said it would be. It was a small, satisfying victory. She spent the day moving from point to point, her world shrinking to the digital readout of the GPS, the texture of the rock under her hammer, and the rustle of her own movements through the undergrowth. She saw no one. She heard nothing but birds, the chittering of squirrels, and the whisper of the wind through the high branches. It was exactly what she had hoped for. When she got back to the cabin, caked in dirt and sweat, she sent the perfunctory text to Greg: "Day 1 complete. All good." Then she took a hot shower, ate a can of soup, and fell asleep reading a novel about Antarctic exploration. The first week passed in a similar rhythm. Each day, she pushed deeper into the survey quadrant, growing more comfortable in the terrain. She learned the dips and rises of the land, the game trails that offered easier passage through the dense salal bushes, the particular way the light fell through the trees in the late afternoon. Her body ached in a good way, the ache of muscles being used. The isolation was a clean, sharp thing. It was on the 8th day that the routine was first disturbed. She was working a ridge line on the far eastern edge of the quadrant, a particularly remote and difficult-to-reach area. She found the designated coordinate and looked for the orange flag. It wasn't there. She checked her GPS again. She was in the right spot, within a foot. She circled the area, kicking through ferns and loose soil. Nothing. It was probably an animal, she reasoned. A deer or an elk could have easily knocked it over and kicked it away. Annoyed at the delay, she pulled a spare flag and stake from her pack, hammered it into the ground, and took her sample. As she was packing her gear to move to the next point, she saw it. Tucked into the split trunk of a lightning-scarred cedar tree about 20 feet away was a small object. Curious, she walked over. It was a bird, carved from a single piece of pale wood, maybe alder. It was simple but detailed, the wings swept back as if in flight. It was smooth to the touch, clearly whittled by hand. It wasn't a cheap souvenir. It had a strange, deliberate artistry to it. She figured it must have been left by a hiker or a hunter, a little piece of folk art left in the middle of nowhere. It was odd, but not unsettling. She left it where it was and continued her work, the image of the small wooden bird sticking in her mind. A few days later, she was working in a completely different section of the quadrant, a damp, mossy basin miles from the ridge where she'd found the bird. She located her 5th survey point of the day and stopped cold. There, tied to the top of the orange flag with a piece of twine, was another wooden bird. It was nearly identical to the first. Same pale wood, same smooth finish, same swept-back wings. She untied the bird, her fingers fumbling with the knot. She shoved it into her pocket, the smooth wood feeling cold against her leg. She finished her work at the site quickly, her movements jerky and inefficient. She kept glancing over her shoulder, straining to hear anything over the sound of her own breathing. The rest of the day was agonizing. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She felt exposed, a bright orange flag in a sea of green and brown. The thought that someone could be tracking her, following her through this wilderness, was terrifying. They could be anywhere, just beyond the screen of foliage, watching her every move. When she finally got back to the Forester, she threw her pack in the back and locked the doors with a loud, definitive click. She drove back to the cabin with the windows rolled up, despite the afternoon heat. That night, the silence of the cabin was no longer comforting. It was tense, expectant. She lay in the loft, wide awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the small house settling. She replayed the day in her mind. Who could it be? A disgruntled local who didn't want a mining company sniffing around? A prankster with a warped sense of humor? Or something worse? She got up and went downstairs. She checked the lock on the front door. It was a simple deadbolt. She peered out the window, but could see nothing but the reflection of her own pale, worried face against the impenetrable blackness of the forest. The second wooden bird sat on the kitchen counter, a pale shape in the gloom. Felt like a message, a claim. "This is my forest," it seemed to say. "You are a trespasser." The next morning, she debated calling Greg. But what would she say? That she'd found some wood carvings and it had spooked her? He'd think she was paranoid, unable to handle the isolation of the job. She needed this contract, needed the positive review for her next assignment. So she said nothing. She packed her gear, her hand hesitating over the satellite beacon. It was for emergencies only, a broken leg, a serious fall. Was this an emergency? It didn't feel like it. Felt like a threat, but a nebulous one. She left the beacon on the counter. Her unease followed her into the woods. She moved with a heightened, painful awareness. She tried to be quieter, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches, as if she could somehow become invisible. The work, which had been a source of focus and satisfaction, was now just a task to be completed as quickly as possible. Every time she stopped to take a sample, she felt a prickling on the back of her neck. She found nothing out of the ordinary for the next 2 days. No more birds, no signs of anyone. She began to wonder if she had overreacted. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. A local woodsman with a unique hobby and a penchant for leaving his work on brightly colored objects. She started to relax, just a little. The knot of fear in her stomach began to loosen. On the third day after finding the second bird, she returned to the cabin late in the afternoon. She was tired, muddy, and ready for a shower. She dropped her pack on the porch and unlocked the door. As she stepped inside, she stopped. The air was different, colder, and there was a smell that didn't belong. A faint, cloying scent, like stale sweat and damp wool. Her eyes scanned the small room. Everything looked normal. Her books were on the table. Her laptop was where she'd left it. Then she saw it. On the floor, in the very center of the worn braided rug, a single muddy footprint. It was large, much larger than her own boot print, and clearly defined. It was from a heavy work boot with a deep, aggressive tread. And next to it, placed with deliberate care, was a third wooden bird. A cold wave of adrenaline washed over Maya, prickling her skin and making the fine hairs on her arms stand up. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't even breathe. Her mind struggled to process the violation. The footprint wasn't just dirt on the floor. It was a statement. It was proof that the vague, creeping dread she'd felt in the forest had followed her home, had crossed her threshold, and was now standing, metaphorically, right in front of her. Her gaze darted from the muddy print to the wooden bird, then flickered towards the narrow staircase leading to the sleeping loft. Is someone still here? The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was heavy with possibility, thick with the presence of another. The faint smell of damp wool and sweat seemed to grow stronger, as if the person who made the print had just left, or worse, was holding their breath in the shadows of the loft. Slowly, carefully, she took a step backward, her boots scuffing softly on the porch boards. She didn't turn her back. Her eyes remained locked on the dark interior of the cabin. She backed away until her shoulders hit the solid wood of the porch railing. Her hand fumbled behind her, gripping the splintery wood. Her keys were in her pocket. Her car was 20 feet away. Another backward step, then another. Her movements were stiff, robotic. When she reached the edge of the porch steps, she finally turned and scrambled down, nearly tripping in her haste. She ran to the forester, her fingers fumbling with the keys, the simple act of finding the right one and pushing the unlock button feeling impossibly complex. The car chirped, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. She yanked the driver's side door open, slid inside, and slammed it shut. She hit the lock button, the thud of the mechanisms engaging in all four doors a small, hollow comfort. She sat there, breathing heavily, chest heaving. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped thing. She stared at the cabin, its windows like vacant eyes. Nothing moved. No one came out. Was she overreacting? Had someone simply come to the door, found it unlocked, and left a strange calling card? She had been so careful about locking it. She was sure she had. Hadn't she? The doubt was a new, insidious kind of fear. She snatched her phone from the center console. One bar. It flickered, threatening to disappear. Not 911. The Douglas County Sheriff's non-emergency line was saved in her contacts, a number the company provided in her orientation packet. She jabbed at the screen with a trembling finger. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, "Sheriff's Office, dispatch." "Hello? Yes, my name is Maya Linden. I'm staying in a rental cabin off Tiller Trail Road. I think someone broke in." Her own voice sounded thin, reedy. "Okay, ma'am. Can you give me the address?" Maya recited the sparse address Mr. Henderson had given her, her eyes still glued to the cabin. "There's no number. It's an A-frame green roof, about 5 miles past Glide." "Are you in the cabin now, Ms. Linden?" No, I'm in my car. In the driveway." "Do you believe the person is still inside?" "I don't know," she whispered. I don't know." "Okay, stay in your vehicle with the doors locked. A deputy will be dispatched to your location. It might take some time, given how far out you are." "Okay," she said, though it wasn't okay at all. "Thank you." She hung up and immediately called Greg. It went straight to voicemail. "Greg, it's Maya. Someone broke into my cabin. I'm okay. I'm in my car. I've called the sheriff. Just call me when you get this." The wait was excruciating. The sun sank lower, and the shadows of the immense firs stretched across the clearing, swallowing her car, then creeping up the walls of the cabin. Every few minutes, she'd start the engine and turn on the headlights, blasting the front of the cabin with light, as if to scare away whatever might be lurking. Then she'd kill the engine, plunging the world back into a deepening twilight, worried about draining the battery. She thought about the footprint again, the deep tread, the size. This wasn't a casual hiker. This was someone who wore serious boots, someone who spent a lot of time on their feet in the woods. Like her. The thought sent another shiver through her. This person wasn't just some random burglar. The birds, the missing flag, now this. It was all connected. It was about her, her work, her presence here. Nearly 45 minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness at the end of the gravel road. A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over Maya. A Douglas County Sheriff's Patrol car, a Ford Explorer, pulled into the clearing and parked beside her Subaru. A deputy climbed out, a tall man with a calm, weathered face. He shone his flashlight beam around the clearing before approaching her window. She rolled it down. "I'm Maya Linden, Deputy Rourke," he said, his voice a low baritone. "You want to tell me what happened?" Standing beside the relative safety of the patrol car, Maya recounted everything. The first bird on the ridge, the second one tied to her survey flag, and now the break-in, the muddy print, the third bird on the rug. Deputy Rourke listened patiently, his expression unreadable. "You're sure you locked the door this morning?" "I'm almost positive," she said, the sliver of doubt returning. "I always do." "All right, I'm going to have a look inside. You stay here." He drew his firearm and approached the cabin cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp white line across the dark wood. He pushed the door open. It wasn't latched, and disappeared inside. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She watched the light from his flashlight move from window to window, the main floor, then up into the loft. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 5 minutes before he reemerged, his weapon holstered. "Nobody's in there now," he said, walking back to her. "But you were right. There's a single boot print on the rug. Looks like it was made with a Vibram sole. And that little wooden bird." He paused. "I checked the doors and windows. No signs of forced entry. The deadbolt on the front door wasn't thrown, but the doorknob lock can be tricky. Easy to think you've locked it when you haven't." The implication was clear. She'd likely been careless. The condescension, however mild, was infuriating. "But what about the footprint? The bird? Someone was in my house. I'm not denying that, ma'am, Rourke said calmly, and I'm not discounting what you've told me about the other items you found. But right now, what we have is a possible unlawful entry. Nothing was taken, nothing was damaged. Strange, I'll give you that, but there's not a lot to go on. He took her statement, writing it all down in a small notebook. The story felt thin and paranoid as she told it again. Wood carvings and a muddy footprint. This quadrant you're surveying, he asked, is it popular with hunters? Hikers? Not this time of year, really, she said, and I'm way off the main trails. There are people who live out here year-round. He mused, looking off into the blackness of the trees. Folks who don't care much for strangers, or for companies coming in to survey the land. Could be someone's way of telling you you're not welcome. By breaking into my cabin? It's a strange world, he said, offering a tired smile. I'll file a report. We'll do some extra patrols out this way, but Tiller Trail is a long road. My advice? Get a better lock for that door. And be extra careful. He gave her a card with the case number on it and left. Maya watched his taillights disappear down the road, leaving her alone again with the cabin and the immense, oppressive darkness. His visit had done little to calm her. If anything, it had made it worse. The threat was real enough for a police report, but not real enough for any real action. She was on her own. There was no way she could sleep in the cabin tonight. Absolutely not. She grabbed her phone. Greg had called back. Maya, what the hell is going on? I got your message. His voice was sharp with concern. She explained everything again, the exhaustion and fear making her voice crack. I can't stay here, Greg. No, absolutely not. Don't stay there. Drive into Roseburg. It's the biggest city in the area. Get a hotel room for the night. The company will cover it. We'll figure this out in the morning. What is there to figure out? I don't know, he admitted. I might have to pull you from the site. I don't like this. Any of it. The thought of quitting, of failing, stung. But the thought of spending another night in that cabin, or another day in those woods, was unbearable. Okay, she said. I'll call you from the hotel. She went back inside, Deputy Rourke's all clear, doing little to quell her fear. The muddy footprint was still there. She avoided looking at it. The bird was gone. Rourke had taken it as evidence. She moved quickly, grabbing her laptop, her wallet, a change of clothes, and her toiletries, stuffing them into her backpack. She felt like an intruder in her own temporary home. Before she left, she took her geological hammer from her survey pack and put it on the passenger seat of the car. It wasn't much, but its dense, steel head was a comfort. The drive to Roseburg, nearly an hour on dark, winding roads, was the longest of her life. The anonymous neutrality of the hotel room in Roseburg was a balm. A chain hotel just off I-5, it was a world away from the oppressive, personal silence of the forest. Here, the quiet was punctuated by the hum of the ice machine down the hall, the distant rumble of trucks on the interstate, and the muffled sound of a television in the next room. Maya double-locked the door, slid the security latch into place, and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. She took a long, hot shower, trying to scrub away the feeling of violation, the lingering scent of damp wool that she could still imagine clinging to the air in the cabin. She called her sister, Chloe, needing to hear a familiar voice. She recounted the events, trying to keep her tone measured, but the fear bled through. You need to get out of there, Maya, Chloe said, her voice tight with worry. I mean it. That is not normal. That is terrifying. I know. My boss is talking about pulling me from the project. Good. Let him. No job is worth this. A guy breaks into your house and leaves you creepy little carvings? This is how horror movies start. It's not a movie, Chloe. This is real. That's what makes it so much scarier. Please, just come home. They talked for another 20 minutes. Chloe's frantic energy a strange comfort. After they hung up, Maya lay on the stiff hotel bedspread and stared at the ceiling. Sleep felt impossible. The image of the muddy footprint was burned into her mind. It wasn't just a track. It was a symbol of her vulnerability. Someone had watched her, learned her routine, and then, with unnerving confidence, had entered her private space. They hadn't stolen anything. They had left something. It was an act of psychological warfare, designed to terrorize, to unnerve, to drive her away. And it was working. The next morning, Greg called early. "I've spoken with corporate and with Mr. Henderson, your landlord. Henderson said he'd go out and change the locks on the cabin today. We've also agreed to suspend field operations for a couple of days. Give things a chance to cool off. Let the sheriff do his thing." "What if things don't cool off?" Maya asked, sitting up. "Then we pull you out," he said without hesitation. "Your safety is the priority. But I also know how much this contract means to you. Apex doesn't like to back down from a project, and abandoning a survey because of potential intimidation tactics doesn't sit well with the higher-ups." He sighed. "They see it as setting a bad precedent. They're willing to let you stay in the hotel in Roseburg for a few more days, on the company's dime. Drive to the site each day instead of living out there. It's more driving, but you'd be in a more secure location at night." It was a compromise, a way for the company to show it was taking her concerns seriously while still pushing to get the job done. A part of her, the stubborn, determined part that had gotten her this far, didn't want to give up. The other part, the primal, fearful part, wanted to pack her car and be on the I-5 North before lunchtime. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take your time. Don't go back to the site today. Just lay low. Call the sheriff's office. See if they have any updates." She called the number on the card Deputy Rourke had given her. She was routed to his voicemail. She left a message, asking if there was any news. Then she spent the day in a state of limbo, wandering around Roseburg, a town she didn't know, feeling conspicuously out of place. She went to a library, sitting at a public computer and searching for information on the Umpqua National Forest. She found articles about local disputes over logging rights, environmental protests, and stories about off-grid communities and lone hermits who live deep in the woods. Any one of them could be her tormentor. The facelessness of the threat was almost as frightening as the acts themselves. Late that afternoon, Deputy Rourke called her back. "Ms. Linden, we did a canvass of the area around your cabin. Spoke to a couple of your neighbors on Tiller Trail. No one saw anything unusual. We also ran a check on your landlord, Henderson. He's an old man, lives in Sutherland, clean record. No red flags. So that's it. For now, yes, there's not much else we can do without more evidence or a new incident. Did you want to report those other items you found? The bird carvings. The one in my cabin wasn't enough?" she asked, an edge to her voice. "We have that one in evidence, yes. But a report on the others establishes a pattern. It would be helpful." "Fine," she said, defeated. "I'll come in tomorrow and file another report." The next day, she drove to the Douglas County Justice Building in Roseburg, a modern, imposing structure of concrete and glass. She sat in a sterile interview room and gave a formal statement to a different deputy, recounting the discovery of the first two birds. The officer was professional but detached. As she signed the paperwork, she felt a profound sense of futility. She was building a paper trail, but it didn't make her feel any safer. After leaving the station, she found herself driving not towards her hotel, but east, back towards Glide. She didn't know why. It felt compulsive. She needed to see the cabin, to see the new lock, to reclaim some sense of control. She drove slowly down Tiller Trail, her anxiety mounting with every mile. As she neared the turnoff for her cabin, she saw a beat-up, dark blue Ford Ranger parked on the shoulder. A man was leaning against the tailgate, smoking a cigarette. He was solidly built, with a thick gray-black beard and watchful eyes. He wore a faded flannel shirt and dirty jeans. As Maya's Forester approached, his head turned, and he watched her car, his expression flat, unreadable. He didn't wave. He just watched. Maya's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She didn't turn into her driveway. She kept going, her heart hammering. Was that him? Was he the one? The image of his face, the intensity of his stare, was seared into her mind. He fit the profile she had been building. A local, someone comfortable in the woods, someone who drove an old truck and wore work boots. She drove another mile down the road, her mind racing, then pulled a U-turn and headed back. She had to know if he was still there. As she passed her turnoff again, the Blue Ranger was gone. The spot where it had been parked was empty. She hesitated for a moment. Then, on a surge of adrenaline-fueled resolve, she turned down the gravel road to her cabin. She had to see. The cabin looked just as it had before, quiet and still in the afternoon light. She pulled up and got out, her geological hammer in her hand. The front door had a new, shiny brass deadbolt. Mr. Henderson had kept his word. She unlocked it. The key was under the same ceramic pot, and pushed the door open. The cabin was just as she had left it. The muddy footprint was gone. Mr. Henderson must have cleaned it up. She did a quick, thorough search of the small space, her hammer held tightly in her hand. The loft, the small closet, the bathroom. It was empty. It was safe. She was about to leave when she noticed something on the kitchen counter. Next to the sink, where she had left the second wooden bird before the break-in, was a small pile of wood shavings, pale like alder wood, and next to the shavings, scratched lightly into the worn wooden surface of the counter, was a single, crudely drawn symbol, a circle with a vertical line drawn through the middle. Her blood ran cold. He had been back. After the police report, after the landlord had come and gone, he had been back inside her cabin. The new lock meant nothing. The police report meant nothing. He could get in whenever he wanted. The shavings were a message. I was here. I can be here anytime. The symbol, whatever it meant, was a signature. She backed away from the counter, a choked sob escaping her lips. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a relentless psychological assault. She fled the cabin, not even bothering to lock the new deadbolt, and sped away, dust billowing behind her tires. She didn't stop driving until she was back in the anonymous safety of her hotel room in Roseburg, the image of the scratched symbol and the watcher's face on the roadside burning in her mind. This time, she didn't just wedge the chair under the doorknob. She dragged the small writing desk in front of the door as well, creating a heavy, immovable barricade. Sleep offered no escape. Maya's dreams were a frantic slideshow of dark forests, pale wooden birds, and the flat, watchful eyes of the man by the roadside. She kept jolting awake, her heart pounding, certain she could hear the scrape of wood being whittled just outside her hotel room door. By dawn, she was exhausted, a raw nerve ending humming with anxiety and caffeine. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not go back. Not to the cabin, not to the survey quadrant. The company's compromise of driving from Roseburg now seemed laughably naive. The threat wasn't tied to the cabin's location. It was tied to her. The man in the blue truck, the watcher, had seen her car. He knew what she drove. He could be anywhere. He could be in the parking lot of this very hotel. She called Greg before his workday had likely even begun. "I'm done, Greg," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the tremor she felt inside. "I can't do this. I'm coming back." To her relief, there was no argument, only weary resignation in his voice. "I understand, Maya. Don't worry about the equipment. Just leave it in the cabin. Henderson can coordinate with us to retrieve it. Your only job now is to get yourself home safely. Just drive carefully." The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The decision was made. The weight of the contract, the fear of failure, it all evaporated, replaced by the singular, urgent need to flee. Packing was a simple, mechanical process. She threw her few belongings into her duffel bag. Before she left the hotel, she logged onto the library's public records website again. She typed in Douglas County Property Records and navigated to the online map server. It was a long shot, but she had to try. She located Tiller Trail Road and zoomed in, clicking on the parcels of land near her rental cabin. Most were owned by timber companies or the federal government. But then she found it. A 40-acre plot, 2 parcels down from Mr. Henderson's property, registered to a Caleb Rourke. Rourke, the name was a jolt. Deputy Rourke. Couldn't be a coincidence. The calm, reassuring deputy who had taken her report, who had subtly downplayed her fears, owned land just down the road. Why hadn't he mentioned that? It was a glaring conflict of interest, a piece of information he had deliberately withheld. Her mind spun, recontextualizing her interaction with him. His placid demeanor, his suggestion that she had probably left the door unlocked, his musings about locals who didn't like strangers. It all felt different now. Less like a tired cop dealing with a spooked civilian and more like a careful gatekeeper, managing an intrusion on his territory. Was he connected to the man in the blue truck? Were they brothers? Friends? Was the deputy protecting him? The questions were a new, more sinister layer of fear. The threat wasn't just a lone, unstable hermit. It might be woven into the very fabric of the community, into the local law enforcement. She was not just an outsider. She was an adversary to a system she couldn't see. She had one last stop to make. She had to go back to the cabin. Not to stay, but to retrieve the single piece of evidence she still possessed. The second wooden bird, the one she had shoved in her pocket after finding it tied to the survey flag. She had left it on the kitchen counter in her haste. Deputy Rourke had taken the one from the break-in, but this one was hers. It felt vital, a tangible piece of the nightmare she had to take with her. The drive back to Tiller Trail was an act of sheer will. Every approaching vehicle made her flinch. She half expected to see the blue Ford Ranger around every bend. The road to the cabin was empty. She parked, leaving the engine running, and ran inside. The cabin was cold and still. The pile of wood shavings and the scratch symbol were still on the counter. She scanned the surface. The bird was gone. Her stomach dropped. Of course it was gone. He had come back again. Or maybe Henderson had cleaned it up when he changed the lock. No, he would have wiped away the shavings too. This was the Watcher. He had taken it. He was collecting his things. As she turned to leave, her eye caught something else. Her survey maps, which she had left neatly stacked on the small dining table, were disturbed. A single map was laid out, separate from the others. It was the topographical map for the far eastern ridge, the area where she had found the first bird, where the survey flag had been missing. And in the center of the map, circled in thick red marker, was one of her GPS grid points. It was a point she hadn't reached yet, one scheduled for the following week. And next to the circle, the same symbol from the counter was drawn, the circle with the vertical line through it. This was no longer a vague warning to leave. This was an invitation, a summons. Come here. Find me. The red circle felt like a target, and she was the bullseye. She backed away from the table, grabbed her backpack, and ran from the cabin for the last time. She didn't look back. She drove straight through Glide without stopping, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. She didn't relax until she was merging onto the I-5 North, swallowed by the anonymity of the freeway traffic. The Umpqua National Forest receded behind her, a dark green mass of secrets and menace. The drive back to her small apartment in Portland was a blur of caffeine and paranoia. She kept picturing the man from the roadside, Caleb Rourke the landowner, Deputy Rourke the gatekeeper. Were they all the same person? Or a network of them, a family, a community protecting something in that forest? What was at that spot on the map that they didn't want Apex Geotechnical to find? An illegal logging operation? A poacher's camp? A hidden homestead? Or something far worse? Back in her apartment, the familiar surroundings felt alien. The normal sounds of her city neighborhood, the distant siren, the rumble of the Max train, did little to soothe her. She felt marked. The fear had followed her home. That night, she barricaded her own apartment door with a chair, just as she had in the hotel. A week passed. She emailed Greg a formal resignation, citing personal safety concerns. He was understanding. Apex Geotechnical paid her for the weeks she had worked and a small severance. The contract was officially terminated. The connection was severed, but it didn't feel over. She couldn't stop thinking about the map, the red circle, the symbol. The unanswered questions gnawed at her. She spent hours online, falling down rabbit holes. She searched for the symbol, trying different combinations of keywords: forest symbol, hiker marking, hobo code, pagan symbols. She found nothing. She searched for Caleb Rourke of Douglas County. She found a few public records, property taxes, a fishing license, But no photos, no social media presence. He was a ghost. One evening, she was looking at a satellite view of the Umpqua National Forest on her laptop, tracing the logging roads she had driven. She found Tiller Trail, then zoomed in, trying to estimate where the cabin was, where the blue truck had been parked, where the parcel of land owned by Caleb Rourke began. As she scrolled eastward, following the contours of the land toward the survey quadrant, she saw it. A tiny, unnatural shape in the sea of green. A small, square structure, barely visible through the dense canopy, miles from any official road or trail. It was located almost exactly where the red-circled grid point on her map had been. Someone was living out there, deep in the forest, far from everything. And they had known she was coming. They had tracked her, studied her, and with chilling precision, they had dismantled her sense of safety until she had no choice but to run. They had protected their isolation. They had won. She closed the laptop. She had her answer, or at least an answer that was enough. Knowing more, she realized, would not bring her peace. She would never know for sure who the man was, or what the birds meant, or why Deputy Rourke had hidden his connection to the land. The woods held their secrets, but the fear lingered. Sometimes, late at night, she would think she smelled cedar and damp wool. And every time she saw an old, dark blue Ford pickup truck, her heart would seize, just for a second, as she braced herself to see a bearded man with flat, watchful eyes staring back at her. The decision to leave the forest was a release valve, but the pressure didn't vanish. It simply redistributed itself, a low, constant hum of anxiety that settled into the foundation of her life in Portland. She tried to reclaim her old routines. She updated her resume, forced herself to go to the grocery store, and met a friend for coffee in the Pearl District. She smiled. She nodded. She made all the appropriate noises, but a part of her consciousness was always detached, standing guard. Every dark blue pickup truck that passed her on the street caused a full-body flinch. Every bearded man in a flannel shirt drew her wary gaze. Portland was full of them. They were background characters in her old life. Now they were all potential threats. She found herself studying faces in crowds, searching for the flat, watchful eyes she couldn't forget. The city, once a comforting home, now felt like a larger, more complex forest, and she was still the prey. Her apartment on the second floor of a brick building in the Buckman neighborhood had always been her sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage with glass walls. She kept the blinds closed. She rechecked the lock on her door multiple times before she could even think about sleeping. The heavy desk remained pushed up against it, a monument to her fear. Her friend, Anya, had noticed the change during their coffee meeting. "You seem a million miles away," she'd said, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything okay with that job you were so excited about?" Maya gave a vague, practiced answer. "It was more isolated than I thought. It just wasn't a good fit." She couldn't bring herself to tell the whole story. To say it out loud to someone who hadn't been there would make it sound like a delusion, a paranoid fantasy concocted from loneliness and stress. The story about the deputy owning the adjacent land would sound like a conspiracy theory. She was trapped with her fear, alone. About 2 weeks after her return, she forced herself to move the desk away from the door. This was ridiculous. She was in Portland, a major metropolitan area, over 100 miles from Tiller Trail. He wasn't here. He was a hermit, a territorial recluse. His goal was to drive her away, and he had succeeded. It was over. That morning, she decided to drive to the library to use their faster internet for job applications. It was a clear, crisp autumn day. She walked down the exterior set of stairs from her apartment to the street below, breathing in the city air, a mix of exhaust fumes and damp leaves. As she approached her Subaru, she stopped. There, stuck into the narrow grass verge between the sidewalk and the curb, was a thin metal stake. It was right beside her driver's side door. At the top of the stake, fluttering in the slight breeze, was a small, tattered piece of bright orange plastic flagging tape. It was one of her survey markers. Maya stared at it, her vision narrowing until the orange flag was the only thing in the world. It was impossible. Couldn't be here. Her markers, her entire set of them, were in her survey kit. And her survey kit was in the cabin in Umpqua. He must have taken one. He must have gone through her gear that day, the day he left the footprint and the bird. He had taken it as a souvenir, a tool. And he had brought it here. He had followed her. He knew her car. He knew her neighborhood. He knew where she lived. The sheer audacity of it, the chilling intimacy of the gesture, was staggering. This wasn't just a message to stay away from his forest. This was a new message. I can get to you anywhere. You are not safe. Her breath hitched. Her legs felt weak. She looked frantically up and down the street. A woman walking a dog. A man unloading groceries from his car. A cyclist whizzing past. No blue truck. No watcher. But he had been here. He had stood on this patch of sidewalk right where she was standing now. He had looked up at her window. She stumbled back, away from the car, away from the obscene orange flag. She turned and ran back up the stairs, her keys digging into her palm. Inside her apartment, she slammed the door, threw the deadbolt, and dragged the heavy desk back into place with a loud, scraping groan. She collapsed onto the floor, her back against the door, hyperventilating. The police. She had to call the police. But the words died in her throat. What would she say? There's a survey marker, a piece of my old work equipment, outside my apartment. They would ask her if she was being threatened. I don't know. They would ask if she saw who put it there. No, it would sound like a prank. It would sound like nothing. Deputy Rourke's calm, dismissive face swam in her memory. She couldn't trust them. She was utterly, completely alone in this. The rage came then, hot and sharp, cutting through the fear. Who was this person? Who did he think he was? The passive terror she'd been living with curdled into a hard knot of resolve. She couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere left to run. She scrambled to her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't looking for vague symbols anymore. She was looking for a man, Caleb Rourke. She returned to the Douglas County records, but this time she dug deeper, cross-referencing tax rolls, voter registration databases, anything public she could find. She found a birth date, 1968. She found a P.O. box in Glide as a mailing address, but no physical street address. She found no criminal record, not even a traffic violation. He was, as far as the public-facing internet was concerned, a ghost who owned 40 acres of trees. She needed more. She needed a face. She needed to know who she was fighting. The thought of Deputy Rourke, his possible connection, his deception, kept circling in her mind. Was it him? It seemed impossible for a sworn officer of the law to be engaged in this kind of sustained, bizarre stalking. But he had lied by omission. He was involved somehow. She needed to go back. The idea was insane, and she knew it. It was the exact opposite of what every rational instinct for self-preservation was screaming at her to do. But the orange flag on her sidewalk had changed the equation. The battlefield wasn't the forest anymore. It was her life. And the only way to fight back, the only way to get answers, was to return to the source. Not as a surveyor, not as a victim, but as a hunter. She wouldn't go to the cabin. She wouldn't go near Tiller Trail. But she needed to get closer, to observe, to understand. She needed to see the blue Ford Ranger again and find out who was driving it. And she needed to find out why Deputy Rourke had kept his land a secret. She needed a plan. The plan began to form, not as a coherent strategy, but as a series of necessary deceptions. She couldn't tell anyone what she was doing. Not Chloe, not Anya, not her parents. They would try to stop her, and their panic would only erode her own fragile resolve. She told them she was taking a road trip, a mental health break to clear her head after quitting the job. She packed a small bag, but this time it contained different tools. Binoculars, a detailed state road atlas, a new, cheap pay-as-you-go burner phone. She left her real smartphone and her laptop behind, locked in a drawer. She would create no digital breadcrumbs. She also purchased a small, high-capacity portable power bank, the kind that could recharge a phone multiple times. Her most important purchase, however, was a GPS tracking device. It was a small magnetic puck, no bigger than a box of matches, with a battery life of several weeks. She spent an evening in her apartment reading the instructions, learning how to pair it with the burner phone, her heart a cold, steady drum. She didn't drive her Forester. It was compromised, he knew it. Instead, she rented a car from a small, independent agency in a different part of town, paying in cash. She chose the most nondescript vehicle on the lot, a silver Toyota Camry. It was the color of asphalt, the color of apathy, a car designed to be forgotten. The drive south on I-5 was surreal. The first time, she had been filled with nervous excitement about a new job. The second time, she was fleeing in raw terror. This time, she was a predator, her senses heightened, every detail of the landscape imbued with potential meaning. She didn't drive all the way to Glide. Instead, she booked a room in a cheap motel in Canyonville, a small town about 30 miles north of Roseburg, nestled on the edge of the forest but far from Tiller Trail. It was a place of transient truckers and casino-goers, another pocket of anonymity. From her motel room, she began her reconnaissance. Her first target was not the watcher, but the deputy. She needed to understand his role. She spent a day simply observing the Douglas County Justice Building from the parking lot of a nearby fast food restaurant. She watched the shift changes, the patrol cars coming and going. Late in the afternoon, she saw him. Deputy Rourke emerged from the building, looking exactly as she remembered, tall, composed, authoritative. He got into his personal vehicle, not a patrol car, but a late-model gray Ford F-150, not the Blue Ranger. She followed him. Her heart pounded as she pulled the Camry out onto the street, keeping several cars between them. He drove to a modest ranch-style house in a quiet residential neighborhood in Roseburg. He got out, went inside. A few minutes later, a woman came out to get the mail. A child's bicycle lay on its side in the front yard. This was his home. Family man. A normal life. It didn't fit with the image of a co-conspirator in a campaign of rural terror. The dissonance was unsettling. Was she wrong about him? The next day, she shifted her focus. She drove the silver Camry towards Glide, her stomach in knots. She didn't take Tiller Trail. Instead, she explored the labyrinth of surrounding logging roads and county highways, using the atlas to stay oriented. She was looking for the blue Ford Ranger. She spent hours driving, her eyes scanning every dirt track, every driveway, every pull-off. She found it on the third day. It was parked outside the feed store in the center of Glide. The same beat-up, dark blue truck, with a distinctive pattern of rust on the passenger side door. Maya parked her Camry across the street, her hands shaking. This was it. She watched, her binoculars pressed to her eyes. After 10 minutes, a man came out of the store carrying a heavy sack of feed. It was him, the man from the roadside, the watcher. He was older than she'd thought, maybe in his late 50s, with a weathered face and a physicality that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. He moved with a slow, deliberate strength. He heaved the sack into the back of the Ranger with a grunt, then climbed into the driver's seat. This was her moment. The plan, which had felt so abstract, was now terrifyingly real. He started the truck, the engine turning over with a familiar diesel clatter. He pulled out onto the highway. Maya waited for a logging truck to pass, then followed. He drove through Glide and turned, not onto Tiller Trail, but onto another county road heading deeper into the mountains. This was her chance. He stopped at a stop sign, waiting for traffic. Maya pulled her Camry up behind a row of parked cars 100 feet back. She got out, her movements feeling both lightning fast and agonizingly slow. She walked quickly, her head down, like she was heading for the post office next door. As she passed the rear of his truck, she stooped, pretending to tie her shoe. Her hand darted out, slapping the magnetic GPS tracker onto the underside of his rear bumper, hiding it behind a thick layer of mud and grime. She stood up and walked away without looking back, her heart a jackhammer in her chest. She got back in her car, her hands slick with sweat. She had done it. She drove back to her motel in Canyonville and collapsed onto the bed. She pulled out the burner phone and opened the tracking app. A single blue dot pulsed on the screen. It was moving slowly along a winding road, deeper and deeper into the Umpqua National Forest. She watched as it eventually left the marked road on the map, venturing into a vast, unlabeled green space. Finally, after another 20 minutes, it stopped. It stopped right on top of the satellite image she had found online, the one with the tiny, unnatural square hidden in the trees, the location that had been circled in red on her survey map. She now had a direct, electronic link to her tormentor. She knew where he was. The blue dot pulsed on the screen, a beacon in the wilderness. It was the location of his home, his sanctuary, and now she could watch his every move. The balance of power had shifted. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating. She spent the next 2 days glued to the burner phone. The blue dot barely moved. He was there in his hidden homestead. In the late afternoon of the second day, the dot began to move again, traveled back out of the forest, taking the same route. She watched as it drove through Glide, then continued south, towards Roseburg. It moved through the city streets and then, to her astonishment, it turned into the quiet residential neighborhood where Deputy Rourke lived. The blue dot stopped directly in front of the deputy's house. It stayed there for over an hour before returning to the forest. The confirmation was a cold weight in her stomach. They were connected, the watcher and the deputy. What she had seen wasn't a friendly visit. She cross-referenced the property records again. Caleb Rourke, owner of the forest plot, and Deputy Ethan Rourke, brothers. Deputy Rourke wasn't just a conflicted cop. He was family. He was protecting his brother. He had lied to her, managed her, dismissed her, all to keep her away from whatever his brother, Caleb, was hiding in those woods. And Caleb, the Watcher, had not just been protecting his land. He had been protecting a secret, one his brother in law enforcement was helping him keep. The thought made the hairs on her neck stand up. The entire system she had turned to for help was compromised, working against her from the inside. She was completely on her own, armed with a burner phone and a terrible, dangerous secret. The revelation that the Rourke brothers were working in concert changed the nature of Maya's fear from a primal dread of the unknown to the sharp, calculated terror of a conspiracy. It was no longer a hermit protecting his solitude. It was a coordinated effort by two men, one of whom wore a badge and carried a gun. Her campaign of quiet observation was no longer a proactive measure. It was a reckless dance on the edge of a knife. She stayed in the Canyonville motel for another 3 days, a prisoner of the burner phone. She watched the blue dot. Caleb's movements formed a simple, predictable pattern. He left his homestead every other day, always in the late afternoon. He drove the Blue Ranger to Glide for supplies, or to a gas station in the even smaller town of Tiller. Twice more, he went to his brother's house in Roseburg, never staying for more than an hour or two. He was a creature of rigid routine. Maya knew that watching a dot on a map wasn't enough. It gave her knowledge, but not understanding. The why of it all was still a black hole. What was in that cabin that was so important? What secret bound a recluse and a deputy sheriff together in a campaign of intimidation that reached all the way to her front door in Portland? She had to see. The idea was certifiably insane. She knew this, but the alternative, living the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, a prisoner of a threat she didn't understand, was a different kind of insanity. She had the tracker. She had his routine. She knew when he would be gone. She chose her day carefully. It was a Thursday, one of Caleb's usual trip-to-town days. She woke before dawn, her stomach churning with a nauseous mix of fear and adrenaline. She dressed in dark, practical clothing, black jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and her worn hiking boots. She drove the silver Camry to a public fishing access point on the South Umpqua River, a few miles outside Glide. She parked the car, leaving it in plain sight among the other vehicles belonging to early morning anglers. From there, she would go on foot. She had her own pack now, filled with water, a compass, the power bank for the burner phone, and the geological hammer from her survey kit, which she had retrieved from her own car before leaving Portland. Its weight against her back was a small, cold comfort. She checked the tracker. The blue dot was stationary at the homestead. She began to walk, following a series of little-used Forest Service roads that wound their way east, deeper into the mountains. Her goal was to get into a position a few miles from his location and wait. The hike was arduous. The initial exhilaration of taking action quickly wore off, replaced by the grueling reality of the terrain. The air was cold, the ground damp. The silence of the woods was no longer peaceful. It was a tactical element, a soundscape she had to navigate without adding to it. Every snapped twig under her boot sounded like a gunshot. She found a high point, a rocky outcrop overlooking a vast valley, and settled in to wait. From her vantage point, she could see for miles. The forest was an unbroken canopy of green and gold, the autumn colors muted under a gray, overcast sky. She felt infinitesimally small. At 2:15 p.m., the blue dot on her phone began to move. She watched its slow, inexorable progress on the screen, her heart thudding in her ears. He was leaving. He was following his routine. He was on his way to glide. This was her window. It would be tight. She estimated she had 3 hours, maybe 4 if he went all the way to Roseburg. She scrambled down from the outcrop and began her final approach. She was off trail now, navigating by compass and the GPS on the burner phone, pushing through dense undergrowth of salal and Oregon grape. The homestead was not on a peak or in a valley, but situated on a flattened bench of land halfway up a steep, thickly wooded slope, a location chosen for concealment. She smelled it before she saw it. The faint, comforting scent of wood smoke. Her pace slowed. She moved like a ghost, placing each foot with deliberate care. And then, through a screen of hemlock and fir, she saw it. The cabin was small and brutally simple, constructed of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. The roof was weathered tin. A thin plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney. It was less a house and more a part of the forest, a structure that had grown out of the ground it stood on. It was utterly isolated. The sheer commitment to this level of solitude was breathtaking. She crept closer, her geological hammer now in her hand, its rubber grip slick with sweat. She circled the clearing. The Blue Ranger was gone. A woodshed was stacked high with firewood. A small, overgrown vegetable garden lay dormant for the winter. There were no other signs of life. The cabin had a single door and 2 small windows. She peered through one of the grimy panes of glass. The interior was dark and Spartan. A simple cot, a wooden table and chair, shelves lined with mason jars. It was the dwelling of an ascetic. She tried the door. It was unlocked. Of course it was. Who would he lock it against? He was the deepest secret in this forest. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed the door open and slipped inside, pulling it quietly shut behind her. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke, old wool, and something else. A faint, chemical scent, like turpentine or linseed oil. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom. The one-room space was meticulously organized. Tools hung from pegs on the wall. Her gaze fell upon the table. It was a workbench. Lying on its surface were dozens of whittling knives, chisels, and blocks of pale alder wood. And all around them, in various stages of completion, were the birds. There were hundreds of them. They covered every available surface. Shelves were filled with them. They hung from the rafters on pieces of twine, turning slowly in the faint drafts. They were perched on the windowsills, on the headboard of the cot, on the mantel above the stone fireplace. Birds in flight, birds at rest, birds with their heads cocked as if listening. It was an obsession made manifest, a silent, swirling flock of wooden ghosts. This was his work, his art. But it didn't explain the threat, the violation, the trip to Portland. Her eyes scanned the rest of the cabin. She was looking for something that didn't belong, something that explained the connection to Apex Geotechnical, something that was worth protecting with such desperate, terrifying measures. Tucked into a dark corner, mostly hidden by a stack of old blankets, was a wooden chest. It was the only piece of furniture that seemed out of place, its wood darker, more polished than the rest of the rough-hewn cabin. She knelt and lifted the heavy lid. Inside was not a treasure. It was a collection of memories. Old, sepia-toned photographs. A lock of a child's hair tied with a ribbon. A small, worn leather baby shoe. And letters. Dozens of letters. tied in bundles with faded twine, written in an elegant, looping script. Maya picked up the top one. It was dated 30 years ago. "My dearest Caleb," it began. "The woods are a comfort, but your brother is worried about you. We all are. Please come home. The city is not so bad. We can help you. The doctors here can help you." Another letter, from a different hand, was signed Ethan. "Caleb, Mom is gone. She passed this morning. She asked for you. I know you don't read these, but I have to keep sending them. I have to believe you're still out there. I won't let them sell her land. It will always be here for you. It's all that's left of her." A wave of understanding, thick and suffocating, washed over Maya. This wasn't a criminal conspiracy. This was a tragedy. Caleb wasn't a monster. He was a man lost to grief and mental illness, a recluse who had retreated from the world after some unspeakable loss. And Ethan wasn't a corrupt cop. He was a brother, trying to protect a fragile, damaged man, the only way he knew how. He was Caleb's keeper, his link to a world he had abandoned. The birds, the threats, the break-in. It was all the desperate, irrational work of a man terrified of losing the one thing he had left. His isolation, his sanctuary on his mother's land. Her survey, the little orange flags, was the first intrusion he had faced in decades. It was a threat to his entire existence, and he had reacted with the only tools he had, fear and intimidation, honed by a lifetime of solitude. The trip to Portland was not an act of aggression, but of profound, panicked desperation. Her mission of vengeance, her calculated plan, it all dissolved into a profound, aching sadness. She was not a hunter. She was just another person who had stumbled into the blast radius of a family's private sorrow. A notification buzzed on the burner phone in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. The blue dot, it was moving. It was on its way back. And it was moving fast. Faster than it should be. He hadn't gone to glide. He had turned around. He knew she was here. The realization struck Maya with the force of a physical blow. The predictable routine, the trip to town, it had been a trap. He had been testing her. Or maybe he had found the tracker. Maybe he had simply sensed, with the heightened instincts of a man who lived in a state of constant vigilance, that his sanctuary had been breached. It didn't matter how he knew. All that mattered was the blue dot on the screen. A digital predator speeding back to its lair. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She shoved the letters back into the chest, slammed the lid shut, and scrambled to her feet. The cabin, which moments before had been a place of sad revelation, was now a cage, and the owner was coming home. The hundreds of wooden birds seemed to watch her with their blank, carved eyes, silent witnesses to her trespass. She burst out of the cabin door and ran. She didn't think about concealment, only speed. She crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at her face, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in her ears. She had to get back to the Forest Service road, back to the fishing access point, back to the anonymous silver Camry. She glanced at the phone. The blue dot was closing in. He was on the main road now, the one she had to cross. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The forest, which she had navigated with such care on the way in, was now a hostile, tangled maze. She reached the edge of the logging road, a wide gravel track, and skidded to a halt. She could hear it now, the low, rumbling growl of the ranger's diesel engine. It was close, too close. She had two choices: make a break for it and try to cross the road before he saw her, or dive into the ditch and pray he passed by. Before she could decide, the blue truck appeared, barreling around a curve in the road. It wasn't moving at a normal speed. It was flying, kicking up a plume of dust and gravel. Caleb was behind the wheel, a grim, determined silhouette. He wasn't just returning, he was hunting. Maya threw herself sideways, tumbling down the muddy embankment of the ditch just as the truck roared past. The wind from its passage buffeted her, smelling of diesel and hot metal. She lay flat in the wet leaves and ferns, her face pressed into the damp earth, not daring to breathe. She heard the screech of brakes as the truck slammed to a halt 100 yards down the road. right at the point where her trail had met the road. The engine cut out. The silence that followed was absolute, more terrifying than the noise. She heard a truck door slam shut. He was out. He was looking for her. Slowly, she lifted her head, just enough to peer over the top of the ditch. Caleb Rourke was standing in the middle of the road, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He wasn't looking around wildly. His head was tilted, his body still, as if he were listening to the forest itself. He knew the sounds of his woods, and he knew she was a foreign noise in the symphony. He began to walk. He moved with a slow, unnerving patience, his eyes scanning the trees, the undergrowth, the ditch where she lay hidden. Every step he took was a tick of a clock counting down to her discovery. Maya's mind raced. The Camry was miles away. Her phone had a signal, but who would she call? The local sheriff was the brother of the man hunting her with a rifle. The futility of her situation was a lead weight in her gut. Caleb stopped, his gaze sweeping over her position. For a heart-stopping second, she was sure he had seen her. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to lock onto hers. But then his head turned, his attention drawn by a sound from farther down the road. Another vehicle was approaching. Headlights appeared around the bend. It was a gray Ford F-150. Deputy Ethan Rourke. He pulled up beside his brother's truck and got out. He wasn't in uniform. He wore jeans and a heavy jacket. He saw Caleb standing in the road with the rifle, and his posture stiffened. "Caleb, what is it? What's going on?" Ethan's voice was sharp, laced with alarm. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He just gestured with the rifle barrel towards the woods, towards the area where Maya was hiding. Someone was here, at the house. Ethan ran a hand over his face, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and fear. "Are you sure?" The door was open. "Things were moved," Caleb said, his voice a low, rough growl. "I found this on the bumper." He held up his other hand. In his palm was the small, black magnetic GPS tracker. Maya's blood ran cold. He had found it. The tool she had used to hunt him was now evidence of her crime. "Jesus Christ," Ethan breathed. He looked around wildly, his gaze sweeping the forest, just as his brothers had. "Who? Did you see them?" "No, but they're close. I can feel it." Ethan walked over to his brother, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "Caleb, you need to put the gun away. You can't be out here like this. We'll handle this. Just get back in your truck." "They were in our house," Caleb repeated, his voice rising, a tremor of agitation running through it. "They went through Mom's things." I know, and we'll find them. But not like this. This is how people get hurt. This is how you get taken away from here. Is that what you want?" The words seemed to have an effect. The tension in Caleb's shoulders eased slightly. He looked from his brother to the rifle in his hands, then back to the woods. The raw anger in his face was being replaced by a familiar, hunted look of fear. "Go home, Caleb," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "Lock the door. I'll take a look around. I'll find them." For a long moment, Caleb didn't move. Then, with a slow, defeated nod, he turned and walked back to his Ranger. He got in, started the engine, and drove away, back towards his cabin. Ethan Rourke stood alone in the road, watching his brother go. The expression on his face was one of profound, bone-deep weariness. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 30 years. He turned his gaze back to the woods, to the exact spot where Maya lay hidden. "I know you're out there," he called out, his voice not threatening, but heavy with resignation. "He's gone. You can come out." Maya didn't move. Was this a trick? "I'm not going to hurt you," Ethan said, his voice strained. "I'm not my brother. I just want to talk. Please, this has to end." Slowly, stiffly, Maya pushed herself up. Her clothes were caked in mud, her face scratched and bleeding. She climbed out of the ditch and stood before him, trembling but defiant. The geological hammer was still clutched in her hand. Ethan's eyes widened slightly as he saw her. He recognized her. "You're the Surveyor," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The woman from the cabin. You're the deputy who lied to me," she countered, her own voice shaking. He had the grace to look ashamed. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you everything. I'm sorry. I never thought he would go that far. Following you to Portland. He's getting worse." He gestured vaguely to the woods. "You have to understand. My brother, he's not well. He hasn't been since we were kids. Something happened. After that, he just retreated. This forest, that cabin, it's the only place he feels safe. When your company started surveying, it was the first real threat to his world in decades. He panicked. He terrorized me," Maya said, the words sharp and bitter. "I know, and I'm sorry," Ethan repeated, his voice thick with sincerity. "I tried to manage it. I tried to scare you off the land, hoping you'd just report it and your company would pull you out. When he broke into your rental, I covered for him. I cleaned up his mess. I've been cleaning up his messes my whole life. Why? Why protect him? Because he's my brother," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "And because I made a promise to my mother that I would always look after him. This is the only way I know how." They stood there in the silence of the forest, two people from different worlds, bound together by the actions of a damaged man. The threat that had consumed Maya's life was laid bare, not as a monstrous evil, but as a sad, desperate, and dangerous family secret. "What happens now?" Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan looked down the road, in the direction his brother had gone. "I don't know," he admitted. "He needs more help than I can give him. And you need to be safe. You need to disappear. Go home. Forget you ever saw this place or us. I'll try to make sure he leaves you alone. That's all I can promise." He pulled out his wallet and took out all the cash he had, a few $100s. "For the tracker. And your trouble." Maya shook her head, pushing his hand away. "It wasn't about money. Just go," he said, his voice pleading. "Please, before he changes his mind and comes back." Maya looked at him, at the desperation in his eyes, the decades of sorrow etched into his face. She thought of the wooden birds, the letters, the baby shoe. She thought of the orange flag on her sidewalk in Portland. There would be no justice. There would be no resolution. There was only a choice: to walk away and reclaim her life, or to be pulled under by the Rourke family's tragedy. She turned and started walking, away from Ethan, away from the forest, her geological hammer hanging heavy at her side. She didn't look back. She just walked, leaving the secrets of the Umpqua National Forest behind her, one muddy footstep at a time. The walk back to the Camry was a long, hollow procession. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound, aching sense of anticlimax. Every rustle in the undergrowth made her jump, her mind still primed for the threat of Caleb's return. But he did not come. The forest remained silent, an impassive observer to her retreat. When she finally reached the fishing access lot, the silver Camry was waiting, an unassuming metal shell that represented her only way out. She got in, locked the doors, and sat for a long time, her muddy hands resting on the steering wheel. She could still feel the phantom weight of the geological hammer in her grip, the cold steel of her fear and anger. Now there was just emptiness. She drove away from Glide, away from the Umpqua, heading north on I-5. She didn't stop until she was back in her apartment in Portland. The desk she had dragged in front of the door looked absurd, a monument to a battle that had ended not with a bang, but with a sad, weary conversation on a lonely logging road. She pushed it back into its proper place. That night, she slept for 12 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep of pure mental and physical depletion. When she woke, the world felt both the same and irrevocably different. The fear was gone, but so was the rage that had propelled her forward. In their place was a quiet, persistent melancholy. She had an answer. She had stared into the heart of the mystery that had upended her life and found not a monster, but a sad, broken man and his hopelessly loyal brother. But the knowledge was a poisoned sort of comfort. It didn't erase the memory of the footprint on her rug, or the bird tied to the survey flag, or the terror of seeing the orange marker on her own street. The violation was real, even if the motive was born of tragedy. A week later, a package arrived. It was a small, plain cardboard box with no return address, postmarked from Roseburg. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to not let the Rourkes back into her life in any form. But a grim curiosity won out. She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was one of the wooden birds. It was exquisitely carved, its alderwood sanded to a silken smoothness, its wings swept back in a posture of flight. Tucked beneath it was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. It was not a letter. It was a cashier's check for $5,000. There was no memo, no signature, just the anonymous, official stamp of a bank in Roseburg. It was from Ethan. It was hush money. It was an apology. It was a final, desperate plea for her to disappear from their lives forever. She looked at the bird, its simple, perfect form. It was beautiful, a piece of folk art born from a mind in torment. It was also a symbol of her terror. She put the bird and the check back in the box, taped it shut, and put it on the highest shelf of her closet, a tangible piece of her ordeal that she could neither keep nor discard. Life began to stitch itself back together, but the seams were visible. She found a new job, an office-based position with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, analyzing soil sample data sent in from the field. It was safe. It was predictable. It was a world away from the deep woods. She never spoke of what happened. The story was too complex, too morally ambiguous. How could she explain that the man who stalked her was also a victim? That the cop who covered it up was also a hero in his own sad story? The narrative was hers alone. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of her new, safe life, the forest would creep back in. She'd see a particular shade of green or smell damp earth after a rain, and she would be back on that logging road, the taste of fear in her mouth. She would find herself scrolling through the Douglas County Sheriff's Office website, looking for Ethan Rourke's name, wondering if he was still on the force, still holding his fragile world together. She'd look at satellite maps of the Umpqua National Forest, her eyes drawn to a specific patch of green, half expecting to see the tiny, square shape of Caleb's cabin erased from the landscape. But it was always there. The fear did not return, but the questions lingered. Did Ethan ever get Caleb the help he needed? Did Caleb ever stop carving his silent flock of birds? Did they ever think of her, the surveyor who had stumbled into their private world and walked away with their secret? One day, years later, she was browsing a small art gallery in Astoria, on the Oregon coast. The gallery specialized in outsider and folk art from the Pacific Northwest. In a glass case, displayed on a piece of black velvet, was a small, pale wooden bird, its wings swept back in flight. The placard beside it read, "Untitled, Feral Sparrow, Artist Unknown, circa 1990 to 2020, found object from the Umpqua National Forest." Maya stared at it, her heart giving a single hard thump. It was his, unmistakably, one of the hundreds from the cabin. It had found its way out of the forest, out of his private world, and into hers. It was just an object now, stripped of its menace, its beauty and its madness displayed for strangers to contemplate. She bought it. She took it home and placed it on her bookshelf, not as a trophy or a reminder of her terror, but as something else, a quiet acknowledgement of the deep, hidden woods and the complex, unknowable lives they contained. It was a symbol of the story she could never tell, and a testament to the fact that she had survived it. The forest was vast and full of secrets, but she had found her way out. For 5 years, the wooden bird on Maya's bookshelf was a fixed point in a life she had carefully rebuilt. It was a reminder, yes, but a distant one, like a photograph of a country she had visited long ago. The sharp edges of the memory had been worn smooth by time and routine. Her job at the Department of Environmental Quality was a comforting world of datasets and regulatory statutes. She lived in a new apartment in a different neighborhood. She had friends who knew nothing of Tiller Trail or the Rourke brothers. The story was a sealed box in the closet of her mind. Then, one Tuesday morning, the seal broke. She was at her desk, sipping coffee and reviewing preliminary water quality reports, when a small news alert popped up on the corner of her screen. It was from a regional Southern Oregon newspaper she had subscribed to years ago in a fit of paranoia and had long since forgotten. The headline was short and stark. Search scaled back for missing Portland hiker in Umpqua Forest. Maya's breath caught. She clicked the link. The article was brief. A 24-year-old man named Alex Peterson had been missing for over a week. An experienced hiker, he had set out for a multi-day trek. His car was found parked at a trailhead. The trailhead for Tiller Trail. The name hit her like a physical shock. Tiller Trail. All the carefully constructed piece of the last 5 years crumbled in an instant. She read the article again, her heart hammering against her ribs. The search had involved helicopters and ground crews. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office was leading the effort. A quote from the coordinating officer stood out. "The terrain is difficult, and he was off-trail," said Sheriff's Deputy Ethan Rourke. "We've exhausted all credible search areas. At this point, we have to consider the possibility of misadventure." Ethan Rourke. He was still there, still a deputy, and he was in charge of the search. The old, cold dread washed over her, familiar and sickening. She saw it all with horrifying clarity. The young hiker, eager and oblivious, pushing through the woods. The wrong turn. The discovery of a hidden cabin. A man who did not want to be found. The desperate, violent reaction. And the brother, the lawman, arriving to manage the scene, to control the narrative, to clean up the mess. Misadventure. The word was a euphemism. A lie designed to close a case that could not be solved. The bird on her bookshelf no longer looked like a piece of art. It looked like a threat. Her neat, tidy conclusion about the Rourkes, the sad, contained family tragedy, felt naive, a story she had told herself so she could sleep at night. But the story wasn't over. It had just found a new victim. A wave of guilt, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. She had walked away. She had kept their secret. She had allowed Ethan to convince her that it was a private matter, that her silence would keep the peace. But her silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only left the trap in the woods baited and waiting for the next person to stumble into it. That night, she couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, the news article open on her phone, Ethan Rourke's name glowing in the dark. She thought of Alex Peterson's family, waiting for news that would never come, a story that would forever be unfinished. She went to her closet and pulled down the cardboard box. It was dusty, sealed with yellowing tape. She opened it. The second wooden bird lay nestled in the tissue paper, and underneath it, the cashier's check for $5,000. She had never been able to bring herself to cash it. Felt like blood money. She picked it up, intending to finally rip it to pieces. She stared at the sterile, printed text from the Umpqua Bank, Rosebud branch. It was payable to Maya Linden. It was a solid, undeniable piece of her past. Her eyes drifted to the memo line, a space she had never paid attention to before. It was blank, or it was supposed to be, but under the lamplight she could see something. Faint, ghostly traces of pencil, mostly erased but still legible if you knew what you were looking for. It wasn't a word. It was a symbol, a perfect, small circle with a single vertical line drawn through its center. Maya dropped the check as if it had burned her. It fluttered to the floor. It was Caleb's symbol, the one he had scratched into the counter of the rental cabin, the one he had drawn in red marker on her survey map, summoning her to his location. It hadn't just been Ethan's idea to pay her off. Caleb had been a part of it. The symbol in the memo line was a signature, a message. It was a deliberate, calculated act. The apology, the hush money, the weary plea on the logging road. It had all been a performance. The brothers weren't just a sick man and his weary protector. They were partners. The story she had constructed, the one that had allowed her to heal, was a lie she had been fed. Ethan wasn't just cleaning up messes. He was an active, willing accomplice in whatever his brother was doing in those woods. The mystery she thought she had solved was not over. She had only scratched the surface. And now, a young man was missing. And the only two people who might know what happened were the same two men who had so meticulously and successfully orchestrated her own silence. The check on the floor was not an apology. It was a receipt for a transaction, proof that she had been bought. and that the secret she had kept was far darker than she had ever imagined. The erased symbol on the check was a key, unlocking a darker chamber of the past. Maya's mind raced, re-examining every detail of her encounter with Ethan on the logging road. His weary resignation, his plea for her to understand, his carefully crafted story of a protective brother watching over a fragile recluse. It had all been an act, a masterful piece of psychological manipulation designed to neutralize her. He hadn't been afraid of her exposing them. He had been assessing her, calibrating his performance to her own visible fear and empathy. He had read her perfectly and fed her the exact story that would ensure her silence. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Alex Peterson wasn't a victim of a random tragedy. He was the next logical step in a pattern she had failed to stop. Her silence had been complicity. She knew she couldn't go to the Douglas County Sheriff. Ethan was a part of its machinery. He would intercept any report, dismiss it, bury it. She needed to go around him, over his head. The next morning, she called in sick to work. She spent hours online, researching the hierarchy of law enforcement in Oregon. The Oregon State Police, the Department of Justice, the FBI. The options felt overwhelming, a bureaucratic wall she had to somehow breach. What was her evidence? A 5-year-old memory, a wooden bird, and a nearly erased symbol on a cashier's check. It sounded like the ravings of a madwoman. She needed something more, something current, something that tied the Rourke brothers not just to her own past ordeal, but to the disappearance of Alex Peterson. The news article mentioned that Peterson's car was found at the trailhead. He was an avid social media user, his family had said, documenting his hikes with photos and posts. Maya's fingers flew across the keyboard. She found his Instagram profile. It was public. The profile picture showed a smiling, freckle-faced young man in his early 20s, standing on a mountain peak, the sky a brilliant blue behind him. His feed was a vibrant tapestry of his love for the outdoors. Sunsets over the Cascades, close-ups of wildflowers, gear layouts on his apartment floor. Her stomach clenched as she scrolled down. The last post was dated 9 days ago. It was a photo taken from inside his car. Through the windshield, a familiar wooden sign was visible, Tiller Trail. The caption read, "Into the quiet, disconnecting for a few days. See you on the other side. Hashtag Umpqua National Forest, hashtag solo hike, hashtag get lost." The comments section was a heartbreaking mix of encouragement from before he left and a growing flood of frantic prayers and pleas for his safe return. Maya scrolled through them, her eyes scanning for anything useful. Then she saw it. A comment from a user named Trailcat, posted a day after Alex went missing. "Hey Alex, hope you're having a great time. Weird question, but did you see a guy in a beat-up blue Ford Ranger near the trailhead? Saw him there when I was leaving my hike, and he gave me a super creepy vibe. Just watching." Maya's blood ran cold. It was Caleb. He had been there at the trailhead watching. The exact same behavior. Her fingers trembled as she clicked on the Trailcat profile. It belonged to a woman named Catherine, a fellow Portland hiker. Maya sent her a direct message. "Hi Catherine. My name is Maya. I'm a friend of the Peterson family. I saw your comment on Alex's last post. It's incredibly important. Could you please tell me anything more about the man you saw?" She didn't expect a reply, but 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Hi Maya, this is so awful. I feel so terrible. I almost didn't post it. I filed a tip with the sheriff's office but never heard anything back. I was finishing a day hike and was back at the Tiller Trail lot. This old blue truck was parked there, but it was empty. I got in my car and was about to leave when I saw this man come out of the woods. He just stood there by his truck, watching me. He didn't wave or anything, just stared. He was older, gray beard, flannel shirt. It was just unsettling. It felt possessive, like I was on his turf. Did you report this to Deputy Rourke?" Maya typed. "No, I just called the general tip line. I don't remember the name of the officer I spoke to. They just took my name and number." Of course they had. And the tip had gone straight into a black hole, right where Ethan could bury it. This was it. This was the link. A witness who could place Caleb at the scene, exhibiting the same predatory behavior, right around the time Alex Peterson disappeared. Catherine's testimony corroborated her own experience, lending it a credibility it had previously lacked. Maya knew what she had to do. She couldn't do this over the phone. She had to present her story in person, to an authority outside of Douglas County's sphere of influence. The nearest major Oregon State Police barracks was in Roseburg, but that was too close, too enmeshed with the local sheriff's office. She needed to go to their headquarters. In Salem, she packed a small go-bag, the box with the bird and the check, a printed copy of Catherine's Instagram comment, the burner phone from 5 years ago, its battery long dead but its existence a part of the story. She paused, then went to her bookshelf and took the first bird, the one from the Astoria Gallery. She wrapped it carefully and put it in the bag as well. The drive to Salem was a journey fueled by righteous fury. The melancholy was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a witness. She walked into the sleek, modern headquarters of the Oregon State Police, her heart pounding but her purpose clear. She asked to speak with a detective. She was led to a small, sterile interview room, the kind she had only seen on television. A few minutes later, a woman in plain clothes entered. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of no-nonsense competence. "I'm Detective Miller," she said, sitting down opposite Maya. "I'm told you have information regarding a missing person case in Douglas County." Maya took a deep breath. "I believe I do," she said, her voice steady. "But it's a long story, and it starts 5 years ago." For the next 2 hours, Maya laid it all out. She started with her job as a surveyor and the first wooden bird. She recounted the break-in, the muddy footprint, the terror. She described the watcher in the blue truck, the orange flag on her Portland sidewalk. She told Detective Miller about the GPS tracker, the discovery of the hidden homestead, the confrontation on the logging road with both Rourke brothers. She explained the lie she had been told, the lie she had believed. Then she brought the story to the present. She talked about the news alert, Alex Peterson's last post, and the corroborating witness, Catherine. Finally, she took out her evidence. She placed the 2 birds on the table, their pale wood stark against the gray metal. She showed her the erased symbol on the cashier's check, explaining its significance. Detective Miller listened intently, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt. She just let Maya talk, her eyes occasionally flicking down to the objects on the table. When Maya was finally finished, the room was silent. "You've been carrying this for a long time," Miller said, her voice quiet. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't know what it was," Maya said. "Not until now." Miller picked up one of the birds, turning it over in her hands. "A sworn law enforcement officer covering for his brother is a serious allegation, Ms. Linden. Aiding in a pattern of stalking and intimidation is a career-ending offense. But what you're implying now, that they're involved in the disappearance and possible homicide of this hiker, that's a whole different level." "I know how it sounds," Maya said, "but the pattern is there. The behavior is the same. Only this time, the victim didn't get away." Detective Miller stood up. "I need to make some calls. I need you to stay here. Don't talk to anyone. Don't use your phone. Can you do that?" Maya nodded. Miller left the room, taking the cashier's check with her. Maya was left alone with the 2 wooden birds, sitting on the table like a silent accusation. The weight of her story was finally off her shoulders, but a new, heavier weight had taken its place. The terrifying, unknown consequences of what she had just set in motion. The silence in the interview room stretched into an eternity. Maya's resolve, which had been a shield of armor, began to crack, revealing the raw nerves beneath. She traced the grain of the wooden table with her finger, her mind replaying her own narrative, searching for holes, for inconsistencies that Detective Miller would seize upon. The story sounded insane. She knew it sounded insane. A hermit who whittles, a protective brother, an erased symbol on a 5-year-old check. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to run out of the room, to take back her words, to retreat into the safety of her quiet, anonymous life. An hour passed, then another. The door finally opened, but it wasn't Miller. A uniformed state trooper brought her a bottle of water and a styrofoam cup of coffee. He said nothing, his presence professional and impassive, and left. The gesture was both a small kindness and a confirmation of her new reality. She was no longer just a citizen telling a story. She was a witness, a component in a machine that was now grinding into motion, and she was not free to leave. Finally, just as the afternoon light began to fade, Detective Miller returned. She was accompanied by another man, older, in a suit with the weary, assessing eyes of a career prosecutor. "This is Deputy District Attorney Frank," Miller said by way of introduction. "He'd like to listen." Miller sat down and opened a file. It was thicker than before. "Okay, Ms. Linden, we've done some preliminary work. We pulled the original tip call from the Douglas County line. The one from your witness, Catherine. It was received, logged, and marked NFA. No further action. The officer who took the call and made that determination was Deputy Ethan Rourke." Maya's breath hitched. It was the proof, the direct, procedural evidence of a cover-up. "We also pulled Deputy Rourke's service records," Miller continued, her voice flat and businesslike. "He has an exemplary record, multiple commendations, but his use of personal leave is interesting. He takes an inordinate number of single days off, often at short notice. The dates of his leave over the last 5 years show a significant correlation with your own timeline of events, and with other reports of a suspicious man or unsettling encounters logged by hikers on or near Tiller Trail, all of which were similarly dismissed." The DDA leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Linden, what you've given us is a credible motive for a law enforcement officer to obstruct a missing persons case. What we don't have is any physical evidence tying Caleb or Ethan Rourke to Alex Peterson. His body," Maya whispered. "You think he's dead. A 24-year-old experienced hiker doesn't just vanish in an area he's familiar with. Not without a trace. Not for this long," Miller said grimly. "We're proceeding under the assumption that we are investigating a homicide. And if your story is true, the primary crime scene is likely on Caleb Rourke's property. A property that his brother, a deputy sheriff, would have a vested interest in keeping unsearched. The plan they laid out was terrifying in its simplicity. They couldn't get a warrant for Caleb's property based on a 5-year-old story and a dismissed tip. They needed fresh, undeniable evidence. They needed to get onto the property. And Maya was the only person on Earth who knew how to get there without using the main road. "We want you to show us," Miller said. "We can't ask you to lead a team in. It's too dangerous and you're a civilian. But you can guide 2 of my undercover detectives to a safe observation point. A place where they can get eyes on the property without being detected. The same way you did." Maya felt a wave of nausea. Go back there? Back to that forest, that cabin? The thought was paralyzing. I can't." "We need you, Maya," Miller said, using her first name for the first time. Her voice softened, but her eyes were like steel. "You're the only one who can corroborate the location. You're the only one who can break this open. The Peterson family deserves to know what happened to their son. He doesn't deserve to be some ghost story whispered around a campfire. He deserves to be brought home." The weight of the choice was crushing. Her own safety versus justice for a boy she'd never met. Her silence versus the truth. It wasn't a choice at all. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll do it." The operation came together with chilling speed. They drove south from Salem in an unmarked van, a mobile command center filled with tactical gear and communications equipment. Maya sat in the back with 2 plainclothes detectives, a man named Russo and a woman named Chun. They were quiet, radiating a calm, focused energy that Maya tried to absorb. They studied her hand-drawn maps of the forest, memorizing the terrain she described. They didn't go to the fishing access point. Instead, under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, they were dropped off miles away, on a different, seldom-used logging road. The plan was to make a much longer, more circuitous approach to avoid any possibility of being seen. Stepping back into the Umpqua National Forest was like stepping into a nightmare. Every shadow held a memory. The damp smell of the earth, the immense silence of the trees. It all brought the terror of her last visit flooding back. But this time she wasn't alone. Russo and Chun moved through the woods with a silent, ghostly efficiency that was both comforting and deeply intimidating. They hiked for hours. Maya navigated by instinct and the muscle memory of her own fear, pointing out landmarks she remembered from her frantic escape 5 years prior. Finally, they reached the rocky outcrop where she had first waited, the place that offered a clear, if distant, view of Caleb's homestead. Russo set up a high-powered spotting scope. Chun worked on a series of encrypted communication devices. Maya's job was done. She huddled behind a rock, shivering, watching the small, rough-hewn cabin through her own set of binoculars. The Blue Ranger was parked in the clearing. A thin tendril of smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb was home. They watched for an entire day. Caleb emerged a few times to chop wood, to tend his dormant garden. He moved with the same slow, deliberate pace she remembered. He seemed calm, unaware. There was no sign of a struggle, no freshly disturbed earth, nothing to suggest a recent violent crime. Maya began to doubt herself again. Had she made a terrible mistake? Then, in the late afternoon, a second vehicle arrived. Not the gray F-150. This time, Ethan Rourke was in his official Douglas County Sheriff's patrol car. He parked next to the Ranger and got out in full uniform. He was carrying 2 large, heavy-duty black trash bags. He and Caleb spoke for a moment, their faces grim. Then they went to the woodshed. They didn't take out firewood. From the back of the shed, they began pulling out items and stuffing them into the black bags. From this distance, it was hard to see exactly what the items were. Clothes. A backpack, its color a faded blue, consistent with the one in Alex Peterson's social media photos. Pair of hiking boots. Russo's voice was a low, tense whisper into his radio. "We have visual. They're clearing evidence. I repeat, they are actively clearing evidence." Ethan threw the filled bags into the back of his patrol car. He spoke to Caleb for another moment, then got into his vehicle and drove away. He was using his official capacity, his trusted position as a law enforcement officer, to dispose of the evidence of his brother's crime. "He's heading for the county landfill," Chun said, tracking his movement on a laptop. "We have a team moving to intercept." Caleb remained in the clearing, watching his brother leave. Then he did something that made Maya's blood freeze. He walked over to a large, smoldering burn pile near the edge of the woods. He picked up a long stick and began to poke at the embers, stirring them up. Flames licked up from the pile. A thick, acrid smoke, smelling of chemicals and something else, something sickeningly organic, drifted up into the sky. He was burning the rest of it. "He's destroying the scene," Russo said, his voice hard. "They're moving now. Let's go." The order came through their earpieces. The state tactical team, which had been staged miles away, was closing in. The time for quiet observation was over. The forest erupted in the sound of muffled shouts and cracking branches as the team moved into position to surround the cabin. From her vantage point, Maya watched as armed, camouflaged figures emerged from the trees, their weapons raised. They swarmed the clearing. Caleb looked up from his fire, his face a mask of shock and cornered animal fury. He turned and bolted for the cabin door. "He's armed," Russo shouted, though no one but Maya and Chun could hear him. The tactical team shouted commands, their voices echoing across the valley. "Police, drop your weapon. Get on the ground." Caleb disappeared inside the cabin. A moment later, the front window shattered, and the muzzle of a rifle appeared. He fired a single shot, the crack of the rifle a sharp, violent sound that ripped through the forest's peace. Then, another sound, a single, muffled shot from inside the cabin. And then silence. The tactical team converged on the cabin, broke down the door, and disappeared inside. A moment later, a voice came over Russo's radio, calm and clipped. "Suspect down. Self-inflicted. The scene is secure." It was over. Caleb Rourke, the ghost of the Umpqua Forest, was dead. In the clearing below, the burn pile smoldered, sending a final, dark plume of smoke into the twilight sky. It was the smoke of his secrets, the funeral pyre of a life spent in darkness, finally extinguished. Maya lowered her binoculars, the plastic cool against her trembling hands. The story, at last, had come to its brutal, definitive end. The aftermath was a blur of methodical, grim procedure. As dusk settled over the forest, the clearing around Caleb's cabin transformed into a major crime scene, flooded with the stark, artificial light of portable generators. State police investigators in white coveralls moved with a quiet, purposeful choreography, their voices low and measured. Maya, Russo, and Chun remained at the observation point, silent spectators to the final act. The sounds of the forest, the wind, the insects, the settling of the trees, were replaced by the crackle of radios and the hum of machinery. Later, under the cover of full darkness, they were escorted down from the ridge. They didn't pass through the crime scene. Instead, a trooper led them on a different path, back to the unmarked van. The ride back to Salem was silent. There was nothing left to say. The truth was no longer a story to be told. It was an active investigation, a collection of evidence bags and case files. Maya was no longer the protagonist of her own fear. She was a footnote in the tragic file of Alex Peterson. The state put her up in a hotel near the OSP headquarters. She was a material witness now, and they wanted to keep her close. The next day was a long, formal debriefing with Detective Miller and the DDA. They went over her testimony again, this time with a stenographer present, turning her memories into an official record. Miller filled in some of the gaps. The tactical team that intercepted Ethan Rourke had found the black bags in the back of his patrol car. They contained Alex Peterson's shredded clothing, his boots, his wallet, and his cut-up backpack. Ethan had confessed immediately, his decades of weary defiance crumbling into a torrent of admissions. The story he told was the one Maya had suspected. Alex Peterson had stumbled upon the cabin. Caleb, his paranoia and territoriality escalating with age, had confronted him. There was an argument, a struggle. Caleb, in a fit of rage, had killed him. He had buried the body somewhere in the vast, trackless woods of his 40 acres. Then he had called his brother. The one call he made when the world he had built came crashing down. And Ethan, the weary keeper, had come to clean up the mess, the final, most terrible mess of his brother's life. He had been in the process of systematically destroying any evidence that would link Alex Peterson to the property when Maya's testimony brought the state police to his doorstep. His confession confirms every detail of your account, Miller told Maya, her voice holding a new note of respect. Without you, Alex Peterson would still be a missing person poster. Ethan Rourke would still be a deputy. And Caleb, well, Caleb would still be in those woods, waiting for the next person to make a wrong turn. The trial of Ethan Rourke was a quiet, procedural affair. With his confession and the mountain of evidence, there was little to contest. He pled guilty to charges of hindering prosecution and tampering with physical evidence. He was sentenced to several years in a state penitentiary. He lost his job, his pension, his family, his freedom. Everything he had spent a lifetime trying to balance against the terrible weight of his brother. Maya was not required to testify. Her official statement was all they needed. She followed the case through the news, a distant observer once more. She saw a photo of Ethan in the paper, a mugshot, his face hollowed out, the weary resignation finally replaced by blank despair. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a profound, bottomless sadness for everyone involved. A few weeks after the sentencing, a search team, guided by the grim map of Ethan's confession, found Alex Peterson's remains. He was brought home. His family held a memorial service. In the news photos, they looked shattered but relieved, the agony of not knowing finally at an end. Maya sent them an anonymous donation, using the $5,000 cashier's check from Ethan Rourke. She endorsed it over to a memorial fund set up in Alex's name. It felt like the only clean way to close the circle, to turn the price of her silence into a small, inadequate gesture of restitution. Life returned to a new kind of normal. The fear was gone, truly gone this time, replaced by a scar. It no longer ached, but it was a part of her now, a reminder of the darkness that can hide in the quiet places of the world and in the quiet chambers of the human heart. One cool, clear autumn day, a year after it all ended, Maya drove to the coast. She found herself in Astoria, walking the familiar streets. On an impulse, she went back to the little folk art gallery. She spoke to the owner, an older woman with kind eyes. "A while ago, I bought a small wooden bird from you," Maya began. The placard said it was a found object from the Umpqua National Forest. The owner nodded. "I remember that piece. So simple, but it had a real spirit to it. A logger sold it to me, said he found it tacked to a tree deep in the woods, miles from any trail. Always wondered about the story behind it." "I know the story," Maya said softly, and for the first time she told it. Not the whole bloody, terrifying truth, but a simpler, gentler version. She told the gallery owner about a man who had lost himself in the woods, a man who spoke to the world through the birds he carved. She told her that there were likely hundreds more of them, a silent flock hidden in a cabin that no one would ever find again. She left the gallery and walked to the edge of the water, looking out at the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The forest was behind her. The secrets, the lies, the fear. It was all in the past. She had walked into the dark woods and found her way out, not once, but twice. She had faced the ghosts of the forest, both real and imagined, and she had survived. The bird on her bookshelf was no longer a symbol of terror or a dark secret. It was a reminder that even in the deepest, most silent parts of the woods, a voice can cry out, and sometimes, if the world is lucky, someone is there to hear it. The years that followed were quiet. Maya's life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by the absence of fear, but by the conscious, daily act of keeping it at bay. She was a survivor, and like many survivors, she built her peace on a foundation of carefully maintained routines and deliberate forgetting. The wooden bird from Astoria sat on her bookshelf, a silent, tamed artifact. It was the only piece of the ordeal she had kept, a totem of the story she had finally managed to contain. She excelled at her job. The world of data and environmental regulations was logical, ordered, and blessedly free of moral ambiguity. She made friends, she dated, she traveled. She sent a Christmas card to Detective Miller every year, a small gesture of gratitude to the one person who had believed her. She never received one in return, and she didn't expect to. Theirs was a connection forged in trauma, and its best expression was a respectful distance. On the 5th anniversary of Alex Peterson's memorial service, Maya found herself driving south. It wasn't a planned trip. She had woken up that morning with a strange restlessness, a feeling of unfinished business she couldn't name. She drove without a destination in mind, letting the familiar ribbon of I-5 pull her towards the past. She didn't go to Glide or Tiller Trail. Instead, she ended up in Roseburg. She found the cemetery where Alex was buried. It was a peaceful, well-tended place. His grave was marked by a simple granite headstone engraved with his name, the dates of his brief life, and a small, etched image of a mountain range. A few faded plastic flowers stood in a built-in vase. It was a quiet, unassuming final chapter to a story of such violence and sorrow. She stood there for a long time, a silent witness paying her respects. As she was leaving, she noticed an older man tending to a grave a few rows over. He was meticulously pulling weeds from around a plain, flat marker. He wore a simple work coat and a baseball cap that shadowed his face. There was something about his posture, a familiar stiffness, that made Maya pause. He straightened up, and for a moment his face was visible. It was weathered, lined with a grief so profound it seemed to have reshaped his bones. She didn't know him, but she knew the name on the grave he was tending. It was a family plot with several names. One of them read, Caleb Rourke. It had to be their father or an uncle, a relative left to tend the graves of a family destroyed. Maya felt a pang of sympathy, an emotion she hadn't expected. She turned to leave, not wanting to intrude on his private grief. But as she walked away, he called out, "Excuse me, miss?" His voice was raspy, frail. Maya stopped and turned back. "You were at the Peterson boy's grave," he said. It wasn't a question. "Were you a friend of his?" "No," Maya said quietly. "I just followed the story. I wanted to pay my respects." The man nodded slowly, his eyes, watery and pale blue, studying her face. "A terrible thing, what happened to that boy. A terrible thing." He looked back at the grave. "My boys, they were a part of that. A terrible, terrible thing." He seemed to want to talk, to unburden himself to a stranger. "My Ethan, he gets out next year," the man said, his voice thick with a complicated mix of hope and dread. "He writes. He says he's paid his debt. Says he wants to start over. Somewhere new." "I hope he can," Maya said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "And Caleb," the man trailed off, his gaze lost in the past. "He was never right. Not after what happened to his mother. He saw it. Saw the whole thing. The logging truck. He was just a boy. He hid in the woods for 2 days before they found him. When he came out, the boy we knew was gone. He was just a quiet thing, full of birds and splinters." The story settled over Maya, another piece of the tragedy she hadn't known. It didn't excuse anything, but it deepened the shadows of the past. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and she meant it. The old man just nodded again, turning back to his work, his conversation with her apparently over. The encounter left Maya unsettled. The brief, sad conversation had peeled back a layer of her carefully constructed scar tissue. The drive back to Portland was pensive. She thought about Ethan Rourke getting out of prison. A part of her, a part she was ashamed of, felt a flicker of the old fear. His debt might be paid to society, but she knew with chilling certainty that he would never forget the woman who had brought his world crashing down. A few months later, the first one arrived. It was a simple, manila envelope in her mailbox, with no return address. Her name and address were written in a blocky, unfamiliar hand. Inside, there was no letter, just a single high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of a wooden bird, but it wasn't one of Caleb's. This one was different. It was crude, misshapen, carved from a darker, knotty piece of wood. It was ugly, almost menacing. The wings were jagged, uneven. It looked less like it was in flight and more like it had been broken on a wheel. Tacked to the bird's chest in the photo was a small, square piece of paper. On the paper was a number, the number of her new apartment. Maya stared at the photo, her blood turning to ice. This was not the work of a sad, broken recluse. This was a message. It was pointed, personal, and deeply threatening. It said, "We know who you are. We know where you live now. And we are not Caleb." Her first thought was Ethan. Had he been released early? Was this his way of announcing his return? She searched the online corrections database. He was still incarcerated. Release date was still 6 months away. So it wasn't him. It was someone else. The old man at the cemetery? He had seemed too frail, too lost in his grief. But who else was there? Who else was left to carry the torch of the Rourke's dark legacy? A week later, another envelope arrived. Same blocky handwriting. Inside, another photo of the same ugly bird. But this time, it was taken from a different angle. In the background of the photo, blurred but unmistakable, was the entrance to the DQ building where she worked. This was a campaign. A slow, methodical escalation designed to dismantle her new life, just as Caleb had dismantled her old one. The police, she knew, would be useless. An anonymous photo in the mail was not a crime. It was just paper and ink. But to her, it was a declaration of war. She began taking precautions. She varied her route to work. She stopped going to her usual coffee shop. She scanned every face in the street, looking for anyone who paid her too much attention. The peace she had spent 5 years building was gone, replaced by the exhausting, hyper-vigilant hum of a hunted animal. The third envelope came a month after that. This time, it wasn't a photo. It was the bird itself. It was lying on her doorstep when she came home from work, a grotesque, splintery thing. It was heavier than Caleb's birds, solid and dense, taped to its jagged wing was a single, greasy feather from a crow. She didn't touch it. She stared at it, her mind reeling. Whoever this was, they had been here. They had stood on her welcome mat, placed their hateful totem at her door, and vanished. They were closing in. She finally called Detective Miller. She got her voicemail and left a brief, urgent message. An hour later, Miller called back. Maya explained everything. The old man at the cemetery, Ethan's impending release, the photographs, the ugly bird on her doorstep. "I'll put a watch on your apartment," Miller said, her voice tight with concern. "And I'll put a flag on Ethan Rourke's file. We'll have someone meet him at the gate when he gets out. But Maya, there's not much else I can do officially. An ugly carving isn't a crime. Stay vigilant. Get a security system. Call 911 if you see anything." The advice, though practical, was little comfort. A security system couldn't stop someone who was this patient, this determined. The Rourke family story, she now realized, wasn't a tree that had been felled. It was a root system that had spread underground, sending up new, poisonous shoots in places she could never have predicted. The forest had followed her home, and this time, she had no idea how many ghosts were hiding in the trees. The ugly wooden bird sat on her doorstep like a verdict. Maya photographed it from every angle with her phone. Then, using a plastic bag, she picked it up and dropped it into a shoebox. It was evidence of what she wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't just throw it away. The crow feather, black and oily, felt like a particular desecration. The state police made good on their promise. For a few nights, an unmarked car was parked down the street from her apartment building. Its presence was a temporary shield, but it only amplified her sense of being a target. She installed a high-resolution camera in her peephole and another overlooking her front door. She spent hours watching the recorded footage, scrutinizing every delivery person, every neighbor, every passerby, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign of malice. She found nothing. Her tormentor was a ghost. The watch on her apartment was eventually lifted. The city had bigger problems than a woman receiving strange mail. The feeling of being exposed returned, sharper than ever. She lived in a state of siege, her world shrinking to the well-lit path between her locked car and her barricaded front door. She began to dig into the Rourke family again, this time with a specific, desperate focus. She wasn't just looking for history. She was looking for a suspect. She spent her evenings on genealogy websites and public records databases, tracing the family tree back from the old man she had met at the cemetery, Henry Rourke, Caleb and Ethan's uncle. She discovered that Caleb and Ethan had a cousin, a man named Owen Rourke. He was a few years younger than Ethan, the son of a third brother who had left Oregon decades ago. Public records showed that Owen had a spotty history, a string of minor offenses in his youth in California, followed by a long period of quiet. Then, 6 months ago, he had moved. His last known address was a rental property in Malala, Oregon, less than an hour's drive from Portland. The timing was a cold spike in her gut. He had moved to Oregon right before the first photograph arrived. She found a photo of him, a low-resolution image from an old DMV record. He had the same dark hair as the other Rourkes, but his face was leaner, harder. There was a coiled intensity in his eyes that was different from Caleb's haunted emptiness or Ethan's weary resignation. This was something sharper, more cunning. This was him. It had to be. A cousin, coming to avenge the destruction of his family. But why now? Why after all these years? The answer, she suspected, was tied to Ethan's impending release. Perhaps they had been in contact. Perhaps this was a coordinated campaign, a prelude to Ethan's return. The fourth envelope arrived a month before Ethan's scheduled release. This one was different. It wasn't a photograph. It was a newspaper clipping. The article, yellowed with age, was from a small local paper dated over 30 years ago. The headline read, "Local woman dies in tragic logging truck accident." It was the story of Caleb and Ethan's mother's death. Maya read the brief, dispassionate account of the accident, her hands trembling. But it was the accompanying photo that held her attention. It was a grainy, black and white shot of the accident scene. the overturned logging truck, the crushed sedan. And in the foreground, standing beside a grim-faced sheriff's deputy, was a small, dark-haired boy with wide, terrified eyes. It was Caleb, the photo from the worst day of his life. Taped to the bottom of the clipping was a small, handwritten note in the same blocky script as the envelopes. It was a single sentence. "He saw your car that day." The words made no sense. "He saw your car that day." Maya reread the sentence a dozen times, her mind racing. What did it mean? She wasn't there. She was a child herself then, living hundreds of miles away. It was impossible. She stared at the grainy photo of the accident. The crushed sedan. It was an older model, its shape generic and indistinct in the poor quality image. But the make, it was a Subaru, an old, boxy station wagon, the same make as her car, the one she had driven to the Umpqua National Forest 5 years ago. A horrifying, impossible thought began to form in her mind, a piece of the puzzle so monstrous she could barely look at it. She scrambled for her laptop, her fingers fumbling on the keys. She searched for the archives of the same local newspaper, paying for a subscription to access the digital records. She found the edition from the day after the accident. There was a follow-up story with more details. It mentioned the driver of the logging truck, who had survived with minor injuries. And it mentioned the driver of the sedan, the woman who had died at the scene. Her name was Elizabeth Rourke. And then, a detail that had been omitted from the first article, a detail that stole the breath from Maya's lungs. There had been another vehicle involved. A third car, which had allegedly run a stop sign, causing the sedan to swerve into the path of the oncoming truck. The third vehicle had not stopped. It was a hit and run. The article concluded with a brief description of the fleeing car, based on the statement of the distraught and injured truck driver. The vehicle was described as a silver or light-colored Toyota Camry. The world tilted on its axis. The silver Toyota Camry, the anonymous rental car she had driven to the forest to plant the tracker on Caleb's truck. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a trigger. Caleb hadn't just seen a stranger's car near his home. In his fractured, trauma-haunted mind, he had seen the ghost of the car that had killed his mother. A silver Camry, the same kind of car, reappearing decades later, intruding upon his sanctuary. To him, Maya wasn't just a surveyor. She was a harbinger of death, an echo of the worst moment of his life, returned to finish the job. The entire campaign of terror, the birds, the footprint, it was all colored by this deep foundational trauma. And Owen knew. He knew the whole story. The note wasn't a random taunt. It was a specific, calculated piece of psychological torture. He was showing her the root of the obsession, the true depth of the madness she had stumbled into. He was telling her that she was not a random victim. She was, in the twisted mythology of his family, the villain of the story. This changed everything. This wasn't just about revenge for Caleb's death and Ethan's imprisonment. This was about a family wound, a generational trauma that had been passed down and festered in the dark. Owen wasn't just an avenger. He was a true believer. He believed his family had been wronged, not just by her, but by the world. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place, and the picture it formed was one of pure, cold-blooded menace. Owen Rourke was not just watching her. He was hunting her, and he was telling her, piece by agonizing piece, exactly why she deserved it. The game had rules, and he was the only one who knew them. And now he had just told her why, in his mind, she had to be erased. The newspaper clipping lay on the table, a yellowed ghost from the past dictating the terror of the present. The knowledge didn't bring freedom. It brought a horrifying, clarifying focus. Owen Rourke wasn't just a garden variety stalker. He was a zealot, a man steeped in a family mythology of victimhood, and he had cast Maya as the story's final monster. He wasn't trying to scare her away. He was building a case for her execution. She knew with absolute certainty that he would not stop. The photographs and the ugly bird were a preamble. The final act was coming. And for the first time in this long, suffocating ordeal, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. Control. He had shown her his hand. He had revealed the why. And in doing so, he had given her a weapon. She put the clipping and the grotesque bird back in their respective boxes and drove directly to Salem. She didn't call ahead. She walked into the OSP headquarters and asked for Detective Miller. This time, she didn't have to wait. Miller saw her in the lobby and immediately ushered her into the same sterile interview room. Maya laid the new evidence on the table. The photos, the crude bird, and the newspaper clipping with its chilling, handwritten note. "He saw your car that day," Miller read aloud, her brow furrowed. She looked at Maya, waiting for the explanation. Maya explained the connection she had made, the rental car, the silver Camry, the hit-and-run driver who had vanished 30 years ago. "He thinks I'm her," Maya said, her voice a low, steady hum. "Or a ghost of her. In his mind, my presence at the forest in that specific car wasn't a coincidence. It was a catalyst. It's what set Caleb off in such a specific, obsessive way. Owen isn't just seeking revenge for Caleb's death. He's seeking justice for his aunts. He's rewriting history, and I'm the villain." Miller stared at the evidence, then back at Maya. The air in the room was thick with the weight of it. "This is motive," Miller said, her voice grim. "This is premeditation. This is a clear-cut case for conspiracy to commit murder. He's not just harassing you. He's building a narrative to justify what he's going to do next." "So you can arrest him?" Maya asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. "No," Miller said, shaking her head. "Not yet. We have a motive, but not a crime beyond mailing threatening materials. A DA would say it's circumstantial. We need to catch him in the act. We need to give him the opportunity to escalate." "You want me to be bait. I want you to be the trap," Miller corrected her. "He's coming for you, Maya. That's a certainty. The only question is whether we are ready for him when he does. We'll set it up at your apartment. We'll be in the next room. We'll be in the walls. He'll never get within 5 feet of you. But we need him to make the move. We need him to cross that line." The thought was terrifying, but the alternative, waiting for him to choose the time and place, was infinitely worse. This was the only way to end it. On her terms. In her space. "Okay," Maya said. "Let's do it." The next 2 days were a blur of quiet, intense preparation. Undercover OSP officers, posing as electricians, wired her apartment with microphones and hidden cameras. A team took over the vacant apartment next door, setting up a command post. Maya's front door was fitted with a silent magnetic lock that could be triggered remotely. Detective Miller walked her through the plan a dozen times. The moment Owen entered the apartment, she was to say a code phrase, "I'm expecting a delivery," and the tactical team would breach the door. On the third night, they were ready. Maya sat on her sofa, the apartment lit only by a single lamp, a book open on her lap. She wasn't reading. She was listening. Every creak of the old building, every footstep in the hall, was a potential prelude. The officers next door were silent. The only sign of their presence was a small, nearly invisible infrared light on her wall that would blink green when they were ready. It was blinking. Hours passed. The quiet stretched her nerves to their breaking point. She began to think he wouldn't come, that she had miscalculated. Then, just after midnight, she heard it. A faint scratching sound at her lock. Not the sound of a key, but of a tool. A pick. Her heart leaped into her throat. She stayed perfectly still, her eyes glued to the front door. The scratching stopped. There was a soft, metallic click. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, silently. The door swung inward. A man stepped inside, closing it gently behind him. It was Owen Rourke. He was dressed in dark clothing, a watch cap pulled low over his forehead. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace. In his gloved hand, he held a knife. He saw her sitting on the sofa, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was a smile of triumph. "Maya Linden," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I was hoping you'd be awake." Maya's mind went blank. The code phrase. She had to say the code phrase, but her throat was paralyzed. He took a step towards her, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "You probably don't understand," he said, taking another step. "This isn't personal. It's cosmic. A debt being paid. My Aunt Elizabeth, my cousin Caleb. They were good people. They loved that forest. It was their church. And you, in your silver car, you brought the serpent into the garden. You desecrated it. He was closer now. The knife was held low, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. Maya could smell the faint scent of motor oil and stale cigarette smoke on his clothes. Her mind was screaming, but no words came out. "Caleb tried to warn you," Owen whispered, his voice hypnotic. "He sent you his messengers. He tried to purify the space you had tainted. But you didn't listen. You came back. You brought the law, the world, crashing down on him. You took everything. So now I have to take everything from you. It's only fair. It's balance." He raised the knife. The infrared light on the wall was still green. Where were they? What were they waiting for? In that split second, as his arm tensed, something inside Maya broke. It was not courage. It was pure, primal instinct. She threw the heavy hardcover book in her lap directly at his face. He flinched, batting it away with his free arm. The momentary distraction was all she had. She scrambled off the sofa, away from him, her voice finally tearing itself from her throat. "I'm expecting a delivery," she screamed. The last word was drowned out by an explosive crash as the front door burst inward, ripped from its hinges by a battering ram. The apartment was flooded with armed tactical officers, red laser dots dancing across Owen's chest. "Drop it! Drop the weapon now!" Owen stared, his face a mask of disbelief. His perfect, righteous plan shattered into a million pieces. For a second, he looked as if he might lunge at Maya anyway, to finish his holy work. Then the fight seemed to drain out of him. The knife clattered to the floor. He slowly raised his empty hands. It was over. The siege was broken. The ghosts were banished. The months that followed were filled with legal proceedings, but Maya experienced them from a distance. Owen Rourke, faced with overwhelming evidence, was declared a persistent threat and sentenced to a long, long time in a secure facility. Detective Miller called to tell her that Ethan had been released. He had been met at the prison gates by OSP officers, served with a permanent restraining order, and informed in no uncertain terms that if he or any member of his family ever so much as breathed Maya's name again, he would disappear into the system forever. He had simply nodded, gotten into a waiting car with his elderly uncle, and vanished. Maya sold her apartment. She quit her job. She packed her few belongings into her car. She kept only one thing from the ordeal. On the passenger seat, wrapped in a soft cloth, was the first wooden bird she had ever found, the one from the Astoria Gallery. She drove north, leaving Oregon behind her. She drove until the forests gave way to rolling hills, and the hills gave way to the wide, open plains. She didn't know where she was going, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt like a comfort. The story was finished. The book was closed, and in the rearview mirror, the dark line of the forest grew smaller and smaller, until it was finally, blessedly, gone.